Exception handling in UiPath will be today's topic tutorial, and today we will learn it more specifically with 4 activities: the try catch, retry scope, throw and rethrow, and then in the end, as a bonus, we'll cover briefly the global exception handler workflow. So let's get started by the try catch activity. So here we can see a very simple sequence that tries to read an Excel file that doesn't exist, causing so an exception, and so this is a perfect use case for the try catch. So first, let's search for try catch on the activities panel and drag the activity to our sequence. So here we can see that this activity is composed by 3 blocks: the try, catches, and finally. So on the try block is where we will place the activity or activities that we want to manage on the try catch activity. So basically here the activities that we put inside, in case of any exception that happens in any of them, we can catch the exception and manage it on the catches block. And so on the catches, we can treat and manage each exception specifically by exception type. So depending on the exception type, we can treat the exception in a different way, or we can keep it very generic and treat every exception in the same way. So let's say that we want to keep it very generic. So here we will have a system.exception catch. And so here inside, we will execute the actions that we want to perform in case of exception. So it could be, for example, to send an email with the error message, or create a ticket, create a log message to add details about the error. So we can do anything that we want here. And then finally, it's a block that is always executed, either if happens or doesn't happen any exception, except the case that if we happens any exception on the try, and then on the exception block we rethrow the exception. So if we throw the exception here on exception blocks on the catches, then that means that we will not go to the finally, but that's just the exception. In all the other cases, the finally, it's a block that is always executed, and it's optional. You just put here something if you need. So here, for example, let's drag the read range activity to the try block. And now if we run, we will see that we'll not see any exception happening, because we are catching it here on the exception block. And so here we can see that we didn't get any exception error. So let's add some details here. So let's add a log message. So here we can add, for example, failed to read Excel file. And now let's add here log level to error. And now if we run again, we will see that now we got here the exception error. So the log message that we put here. So if you want, we can add more details. So we can get those details from the exception that happened. So here, by calling exception, we can get details about it. So if we put a dot, we can get, for example, the message of the exception. And now, for example, we get its source. So if we had exception.source, and now if we run, we'll see some more useful details. So here we can see failed to read Excel file. The workbook does not exist at uipath.excel.activities. Now, as I told previously, we can segregate the way that we treat the exceptions by the exception type. So for example, let's here just move this activity here to the beginning. So we can see the kind of exception that is thrown when an Excel file, the file is not found. So the exception type that happens on this activity. So here, if we go now to the locals panel at exception details, we can see the type of exception. So it's system.argument exception. So let's here copy. Now let's stop. And now let's add a new catch here. and now here we can see it's this one, system.argument exception. And now, for example, let's here add the log message. And here let's just put here appnet system.argument exception. So now if we run here, let's see what happens. So here we can see that was given basically priority to this block instead of the generic one. And why? Because the exception type from this activity that was thrown was specifically .argument exception. And so basically was this block that was executed. And so it's very important to highlight this thing because we can basically treat different exception types in a different way by creating here the segregation by on the catches per exception type. So now, just for another example, I'll indicate here a file that exists. So now if we run, we will see that any exception will happen. However, let's create here exception scenario. So here I'll just open the file, and now if we run our project, we can see that we got an exception, and it was that failed to read the file because it was opened here on the app. So now let's just catch the exception type. So to catch it very simply, we can just here now run the project. So first I'll just open the file again and run again. And so here we can see on exception details, it's a IO exception. So here we can just stop. And now here let's add a new catch. So for IO exception, and if doesn't appear the exception type that you are searching, you can browse here it more specifically. So I'll just add a new catch, and so here log message IO exception. And so now if I close, or better, let's leave it opened. So now if we run again, well, let's just here remove this activity. Now here we can see IO exception. So basically it was thrown an exception and it was an IO exception, and because we have here a specific catches for this kind of exception type, it was executed this one. So now if we didn't have a specific catch for the exception type that happened here, so for example, if we delete these catches, so we can delete by clicking on it and then press the delete button. Oops, my mistake, let's do again. So here we can see that now we just have the exception and argument exception. So guess what is the one that will be executed? So to where the bot will go on this case. So it will be the exception catch because it's a generic one. So here we can see that now the bot was throughout this catch. So the generic one, the system.exception, and so failed to read Excel file. And here we can see the details about the error. Now just covering very briefly that finally we can just see here that is always executed. So here finally block, let's add this log message. And so here let's run it, and we'll see that in the end it was executed and it had an exception. If we close the file, so let's close it. So we will not generate an exception because this file exists. So now if we run again, we can see that the finally block was again executed. However, there is a small exception here that causes the finally block to not be executed. So let's say that you generate an exception from the catches. So you catch the exception and then rethrow the exception, or differently, it happens an exception type that is not catched by the try catch. So to create here very simply this case, if we delete the exception block, well, here it's just exception block. So this means that if it happens now an exception which isn't of the type argument exception, the exception will not be managed by the try catch. So let's just here open the file so we can generate the exception. And now if we run, we'll see basically that the exception is not being captured here, and so we got here the exception. And so we can see also that the finally block was not executed because happened an exception here that was not managed by the try catch, and so we didn't go throughout the final. And so that's for the try catch activities. So now let's move to the next one. Now let's cover the retry scope activity. And here we are trying to automate the login on the web page. So here we can see the URL if you want to follow on your side. The credentials to login are here on this label, on this text. And so here we'll simulate a kind of instability of issues with the browser, so we can see how we can work with the retry scope. So very briefly, the retry scope allows us to retry a set of activities or a single activity while exception isn't met or when it happens an exception. So let's here on activities panel drag the retry scope activity to our sequence. And so here we can see that first we have the action sequence. So here is where we'll place the activities that we want to be covered by the retry scope. So basically, while a condition is not met or when it happens an exception, here basically will be retried all activities that are inside of this sequence. So here, let's drag here this part that basically automates the login on this page. And so now we have two ways to use the retry scope. So we can retry the activities whenever happens an exception on any of these activities. So for example, let's say that the password field is not found by the type into, is thrown an exception. And so if we don't put here any condition, the retry scope will assume that in case of any exception, we won't retry all activities again from the beginning until the end. The other way is to put here a condition. So a condition could say, for example, that while doesn't appear the home page, the dashboard that appear after the successful login, we want, so if it doesn't appear after executing all activities, we want to retry again everything from the beginning. Or we can use both approaches. So let's say that we put here the condition of checking if the login was successful, but in the middle happens an exception here. So if it happens, will be everything retried again from the beginning. And about the retry thing, we can control from these two properties. Number of retries, we can define here the maximum number of retries. By default, if I'm not wrong, is 3 retries, but we can change that by putting here a different number. And then here the retry interval. So here we can put the retry interval between each retry. By default, if I'm not wrong, is 3 seconds, but you can define it here if you want to a different value, like 2 seconds or 5 seconds. Or different, like a minute if you want. You are free to do that. So let's leave this empty, so we'll use the default configuration. So now I'll just run this workflow, and what I'll do, I'll cause an exception. So I'll close the browser in the middle. So here we can see, and now I close the browser, we can see that we got an exception. And so because I ran this on debug mode, basically now it paused without exception here. So let's press continue and let's see what will happen. So we can see that will be retried everything basically. So now was open the browser again and now the login was done. So because happened an exception here and because we are inside of the retry scope, basically was retried everything from the beginning and login was done successfully. Also, just important to highlight, if the maximum number of retries is reached and happens an exception again, what happens is that basically the exception goes up. So it stops the retries when the maximum number of retries is reached. So now let's try to play with the condition thing. So now let's hear, for example, how we could use this condition part. So we could use here a checkup state activity. And so here, let's target the success message. Let's confirm. And now let's close the browser and run again. So the browser was open and we can see that because was found a condition, the required condition, basically the login being successful, wasn't retried again, basically all activities. Now let's simulate the case that this message doesn't appear. How we can cause that? Very simply, let's put here the wrong password. So I'll just add a character. And now let's close. And now let's run again. So now we can see that it's being retried again and was retried, and now will be done another retry, as we can see. However, we'll reach now or in the next one the maximum number of retries, as we can see. And so we got here this exception because we reached the maximum number of retries. So we can see here how we can play in different ways with the retry scope activity, which is a very useful one. So now let's see how to work with the throw activity. For the throw activity, we'll use the previous use case, so the login into this web page. So with a throw, we can throw an exception anytime on the bot, on the automation. So when a specific scenario happens, a specific case, or when appears an element that tells to us that something is wrong or missing, we can choose to throw an exception with a specific message and with a specific exception type, such as business rule exception or system exception. And so here, after doing the login, there is two possible outcomes. So the login can be successful or can be failed. And so when it fails, well, in this case, it's a kind of exception. So we should throw an exception. So here I'm using just a pick and pick branch to detect which of these ones appears first. And so when happens system exception, so well, when the login fails, we can use the throw activity. So here, let's drag the throw. And so here, first we have to say the exception type. So this is a kind of system exception. For example, login credentials are wrong. Let's consider as a system exception. So for that, we put here new exception and then open parentheses and then double quotes. And then we have to say basically here the message, the exception message. So here we can see the login failed. So then here we can just add a log message here on the success side. So just to keep it simple, successful login. So here now let's execute the workflow. So initially it will fail because I put here the wrong password. So let's see if it's working well. So let's run. So now I'll just close here the browser. So the login failed. And here you can see this was thrown an exception. The login failed. So the one that we have defined here because was found this element first. So the one that tells us that something is wrong with the login. And so because was found this one, we here are throwing an exception. So now if we put the right password, so let's put it here. And now let's close the browser and run again, because we found the success one. And now because the login was successful, here we can see successful login. So that's how we can play with a throw. So basically we can throw an exception, either a business rule exception one or a system exception, anytime on the automation when we find something that tells us that something is wrong or missing. So now that we cover the throw, let's see very briefly how to use the rethrow activity. For the rethrow activity, we are using here a very simple case. So here on this page, so you can see here the URL, if you want to follow, we have a drop down. And so currently, if we run, we can see that everything goes well. However, let's imagine that before we had more options. So we had the option number 3 that now doesn't exist. And so now if we run, we will see that we'll get an error because this option will not be found on the dropdown. And so now it will take like 30 seconds to throw the exception because it's the default timeout. So let's change that after getting the exception. And here we got the exception, so it cannot select the item because it wasn't found. So now, for example, how we could play here with the rethrow activity. So first let's change here the timeout to 1 second so we don't waste so much time while working here. And so now the rethrow, first you'll use it in tandem together with the try catch activity. And you'll understand in a few moments why. So first, let's add here, let's surround this with a try catch activity. And so now here, let's open system exception catch. And so initially, let's add here a log message. So we can have here failed to select drop down item. And so now if we run, we will see that the exception will be handled, catched, and handled. So we got the exception. However, if we now run, it stopped because we are running on debug mode. But then the bot found here the exception catch, logged the message, and the exception was handled gracefully. So let's say that when happens an exception, you want, for example, to log details about it. Maybe you want to send an email or create a ticket, you choose the action, and then you want to rethrow this exception back. So we want to take again the exception and rethrow it, so the original exception. And you might be catching this exception on a higher level try catch block, for example. So to rethrow the exception, so basically here we are getting the exception, we are catching it, and now let's say that we want to rethrow, throw again the original exception. So for that, we'll use the rethrow activity. So let's drag here the rethrow. And so now if we run, let's see what happens. So first we'll get here the exception. And now we do here the log message, and then the rethrow, what we'll do, we'll rethrow back the original exception that happened here. So this is very useful, for example, in the cases when you catch an exception, you want to do something about it, for example, put a log message, add some details and something more, and then you just want to rethrow again this exception that probably will be handled by a higher level try catch. So that's one of the scenarios that you can use, and it's very good, the rethrow activity. So now just for example, if we add here another try catch above this one, and now if you add here another catch, a system exception one, you'll see basically got the rethrow. So now let's see what will happen. So if we run, we will see basically that we throw an exception, we will get the log message, then we will throw again the original exception and we'll catch it on this higher level try catch. And here we can see this log message that basically shows us that this try catch, well, the bot has gone throughout this exception block. And that's how we can, well, use the Rethrow activity. So now let's see about the global exception handler. Now let's see about the global exception handler, and for it we'll use again the login use case. So here we can see that we are just simply filling the credentials and click on the login button to perform the login. So now to add the global exception handler, here from the project panel, go to add and then choose the option global handler. And so first remark, we just can have one global exception handler, one global handler per project. So now here we can choose the name if we want or leave the default one, and then let's create. So explaining briefly what does the global exception handler or global handler. So basically, as it says here, it executes a bunch of steps. We can see here the default ones when the project encounters an unmanaged error. By unmanaged error, just to explain, for example, let's say that here this type into fails and there is no try catch to manage the error. So on this case, having a global handler on the project, it will be triggered and the bot will go throughout it. So that's basically how it works. All managed errors will go throughout the global handler if it's added to the project. And so initially, here we can see the default, how it looks. So initially logs the error, and then by default, it sets the project behavior, the bot behavior. So if the number of retries is below than 3, by default, it will retry again the action that failed. Else, if it's equal or above 3, it will abort execution, meaning that the automation will stop. However, we are free to change this. We can change here the retry count, so to 4, for example, until 4 retry, or also we can add here other action types like ignore and continue. So here we are just using the retry and the abort, but we are free to customize this to suit our needs. And now we want the project to behave when there is a managed error. So here, for example, let's simulate an error. So here we can see that we will use this login page. So let's run here on debug mode so we can see on where it fails and where the bot will go. So let's run on debug, it will run. Let's close now the browser to cause here the exception. So probably the click will now fail. So now it will have a timeout of 30 seconds, so it will take some time to throw the exception. So here we can see that we got the error on the click button, and the reason is that we closed the browser before the bot being able to click on the button. So now if we click on step into, we can see that this is error that will not be managed here. We don't have any try catch or something similar. So here we can see that automatically the bot is going throughout the global handler. And so initially log the exception message. So here you can see it was logged. And then because the retry is the first one, the default action, so the action that is by default on the global handler is to retry again the activity. So if we go again, we can see basically that the bot has gone back again to the click activity. And if you click again, it will fail. And we will go again throughout the retry logic. And so now I'll just stop because it will take 30 seconds. So to throw the exception, but basically to show now a different example. So let's say that we cover this activity by a try catch, and let's just put here a catch exception. So to catch the exception, So now we are managing here the exception. Let's see what happens. So now if we run again the bot and just cause here the click to fail, so it will fill the username initially. Now if you close to avoid the click, so to make the click to fail, so it filled the username and password and the click should fail. So now again we have the 30 seconds timeout before being thrown the exception. We could reduce, but now let's just wait. And now we can see that the execution ended. And because we have here the try catch managing any exception that could happen here with this click, basically was not actioned, was not used the global handler. So basically, briefly, the global handler just manages any unmanaged error on our project. And again, we can customize this to suit our preferences and needs. So that's it for this tutorial. If you liked it, please give a thumbs up and now subscribe to the channel and enable notification bells so you don't miss any UiPath tutorials released here on the channel.